FairyGodBoss was born out of a personal misfortune. I was fired when I was 2 months pregnant in one of my last jobs. And it wasn't because I was pregnant, but I was just part of a management shakeup, regime change. I worked for the CEO who was fired. And at that moment, looking for a job, I felt really conscious about my gender and the way it might impact my chances of getting my next job, because I didn't want to tell anybody I was pregnant, and I didn't want to ask some of the things that were really top of mind for me. So things like how many women were on the executive or management team, and what was the company's maternity leave policy, and what was the face time versus results orientedness of the culture at these companies, because I felt, I think intuitively, a little bit worried about being disadvantaged if it was an old boys network at the top of the company, for example.
The topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the hosts and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Geeks, Geezers, and Googlization Show, the home of Googlization Nation, where we talk with HR and business thought leaders about the crazy shift going on in the world of business, technology, and HR. Here's your host, Ira Wolf.
Welcome back, Googlization Nation, and welcome back to another episode of Geeks, Geezers, and Googlization. Have an exciting show today in the HR and business world. There's probably not a day that goes by that you don't hear about diversity, inclusion, equity. They keep popping up. So we're really excited to have Georgene Huang from FairyGodBoss. I guess she's the chief FairyGodBoss. She's chief executive officer and co-founder, and we'll be welcoming her. In the past, we've had a few other people from FairyGodBoss. We had Romy Newman just a few months ago. We had Nicole Garati, I think, back in the fall. And if you're not familiar with FairyGodBoss, it is the largest women's career site in the world. And it was just started a few years ago. So we're really excited to have Georgene here. And we're going to be talking about diversity hiring. Of course, the recession last year was in, many circles called the she session, and we're on the rebound of that. But what's going to happen to women in the workplace? How are we going to, what's that going to look like as far as the diversity, inclusion? And certainly there is a shortage of skilled labor. Companies in every industry and every location seem to be struggling with that. So we'll be bringing on Georgene very shortly. And then our second segment today, I'm actually going to be doing Q&A about pre-employment testing. There's a lot of myths every single day. I get questions about that, especially since that's what our focus is in Success Performance Solutions. And I've collected a number of questions over time. I've written about some of them, but what I wanted to do was address some of those and help people, understand what the benefits are, what some of the disadvantages, or I won't say disadvantages, but what some of the problems are about pre-employment testing are, what some of the confusion, what are some of the myths. And if you have any questions, please share those, put them in the comments, and I'll try to adjust those. A couple of things about headlines. National Federation of Independent Businesses just shared this. 44% of small businesses reported that they had job openings that they couldn't fill. That's double. Think about this. That's double the previous high for the last 48 years. 44%, which means that the highest number of small businesses that had trouble filling job openings was 22%. And as of last month, it was 44%. And the expectation that number is going to continue to climb. That goes along with the Bureau of Labor Statistics report that they had 8.1 million job openings, which is the highest level they've ever reported. before. The previous high was pre-pandemic in 2018. Again, so many companies are really struggling with that. And over the next few weeks, and including today, we'll be talking about what are some of the trends that what are some of the things that companies need to do differently? Because we're just at the beginning of what most economists are talking about, an economic boom through 2022 and 2023. So the good news is the economy is really going to be growing. Bad news is for those who are struggling now with job shortages, it's going to get even more difficult. I want to thank the former guest of the show was Frank Diana. He's a futurist. I follow him all the time. He puts out some really, really great stories. I had one this morning. I know we talked about some of the challenges, talking about the next normal, new normal, returning to normal, going back to normal, and how there really is not going to be some static place. There's not going to be a light switch or effective certain date we go back and everything became normal, because normal is a perception and everybody experienced normal differently. If we go back to the way it was, normal wasn't so good for people of color. It wasn't so good for many women in the workplace. It wasn't so good for lower economic groups. It wasn't so good universally. So what's that normal? I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but he shared something that came up from Peter Hinson, who calls it the never normal. And that sort of aligns with what I talk about on a regular basis, about that we're going to have next waves of normals. That normals everybody's going to experience normal slightly differently, and it's going to come in waves. We're not all going to reach a certain normal at the same time. But he had this interesting quote. In 1911, Ed Klein took out an ad in the New York Times. I'm not sure who Ed Klein was, but I'll take his word for it. I was attempting to convince people to keep buying horses, not cars. After 100 years, there's only one conclusion. Ed was an idiot. So part of what our role is with Geeks Geezers and Googlization is to help you not become another idiot. There's really a lot of smart people. I know everybody has good intentions, but everybody continues to underestimate some of the challenges and how fast things are changing. Before we bring on Georgene and really get to the meat of what we want to talk about, there's a couple other things. I want to congratulate Ngomo, who is one of our sponsors, along with Success Performance Solutions. Ngomo yesterday just launched their app, the official launch of their app. And I hope you go up and check out Ngomo, ngomo.com. They have 80 coaches right now, and congratulate them. And so thank them for being a sponsor and congratulate them as well. And finally, a couple of webinars. This Friday, May 28th at noon, we're going to be doing our monthly webinar with Dr. Ed Gordon. We're going to be doing the Gordon Report. And this month, we're going to be talking about what I was just referring to before, the ticking time bomb, jobs. What's that going to look like? Labor shortages. And then there's two other webinars that are ongoing. You can watch these 24/7, 365. One is the adaptability webinar we did on 5/20. We had a great showing, good participation. If you missed it, we have the replay, and we'll make sure that you can, Roxy, if you can put that up one more time, for people to get the website, which is bit.ly/AQAI 520. And then I also have my recruitment workshop up there. Duct tape can't fix your candidate experience, which is bit.ly FCDD duct tape. Which is bit.ly/FCDD duct tape. And again, those two, the recruitment candidate experience and the AQ webinar, 24/7. You can watch them anytime. So I appreciate that. And then hopefully you'll join us on Friday with Dr. Gordon at noon. At this point, don't want to hesitate. Don't want to prolong this. I want to be able to get Georgene on and talk about what's going on at FairyGodBoss. Georgene, welcome to Geeks Geezers and Googlization.
Great to be with you, Ira.
So is your official title Chief FairyGodBoss?
No, but I definitely have my wings and wear a lot of purple.
For sure. So if people don't know what FairyGodBoss is, and until last year I wasn't fully aware of it, talk about that, what it is, and what was your reason for starting it?
Well, FairyGodBoss is the largest career community for women. We call it a community because that's really what is at the heart and soul of the platform. We're a free place where women can go to meet each other, have candid conversations. Oftentimes in professional spaces like LinkedIn, you have to be the best version of yourself, right? It's your face next to your resume, so you better be saying good things there. And FairyGodBoss is the alternative to that. It's not that you can't say good things, but there's real things that people have to discuss. They often are problems or workplace issues that you can't be so public about. So our community is really safe, inclusive. You can post anonymously, which is key to kind of facilitating some of these candid conversations.
Yeah, I subscribe, and unfortunately, I don't get to go there every day. But every now and then, there's a headline that just captures my attention, and I'll click on that. And some of the stories are just unbelievable that people share. That it's 2021, and some of the experiences that people are having in the workplace, some of the challenges. It's like, why are we still talking about this? I probably got a couple years on you, but it's like, okay, we had women's lib in the 60s and 70s, and so that was taken care of. We had civil rights in the 60s and 70s, so that's all fixed. And here we are in 2021, still trying to figure it out.
Yeah, 2017, Me Too, right? The Me Too movement. Things that are physical crimes, like forget workplace things. And some of those crimes happen in workplaces. And
we still can't get legislation to fix it, right?
Yeah.
or people to step up and do that. So what was your, what prompted you? You obviously had a successful corporate career. You continued that path. You broke through you broke through some ceilings, maybe not as many ceilings as you wanted. But what was your reason for starting, having a startup? That's pretty...
Yes, I'm a first-time founder, and I did entrepreneurial things within the context of big companies in the past. So I think it wasn't completely a new experience. But really, FairyGodBoss was born out of a personal misfortune. I was fired when I was 2 months pregnant in one of my last jobs. And it wasn't because I was pregnant, but I was just part of a management shakeup, regime change. I worked for the CEO who was fired. And at that moment, looking for a job, I felt really conscious about my gender and the way it might impact my chances of getting my next job, because I didn't want to tell anybody I was pregnant, and I didn't want to ask some of the things that were really top of mind for me. So things like how many women were on the executive or management team, and what was the company's maternity leave policy, and what was the FaceTime versus results orientedness of the culture at these companies, because I think intuitively a little bit worried about being disadvantaged if it was an old boys network at the top of the company, for example.
Right. And then we enter, this month is Asian Pacific Indian Heritage Month. And obviously there's one more dimension to add to that, considerations, which again, people, until you're paying attention to it, you don't realize the biases. You just don't. And, I've had certainly an awakening over the last year or two, and probably 3 years from doing Geeks Geezers and Googlization, talking to so many people and finding out how blind we really were, to many of the issues.
Yeah. And I would say that part of it is, in that moment, I was really conscious of my gender because I was physically, carrying a baby. But prior to that, I really did spend a lot of time thinking about my identity in the workplace and whether it mattered or not. And I think that's an interesting common thing I found, that there's this aha moment that, oh, my race or my gender might matter. Because for a while, when things are going well, you kind of say, well, I'm just going to ignore it because thinking about it is going to disadvantage me. Like, why would I want to focus on something that might be negative?
Right. And I'm some sort of experiencing the opposite. And again, there's a lot of very transparent, authentic conversations going on, about it, but, about white privilege. Here, I'm an older white man, and, and I can go down the list of things that I felt prejudiced at the time. Maybe I wasn't tall enough. Maybe I didn't go to the right school, basically Jewish background, now anti-Semitism is coming up. It is rising its colors again, so I can point those out, but it was never quite as evident. And the challenges were never quite as big. They were sort of like, third world problems.
Right.
In comparison, never really worried about, if I got stopped by the police, never really worried about reaching over to the glove compartment to get my registration.
Right.
It's like, wow. And it's like, where was I for these 60 years? That completely oblivious to that. Something as simple as that could be life or death. Yeah. So let's talk about the issues at FairyGodBoss. 2020, I mentioned it was the She session. When I talked to you, had a great report that came out just a few months ago. I think it was the State of Diversity Hiring. Is that the correct name?
Yes.
And I believe you can still download that from the FairyGodBoss site. The one statistic that came out for me, and I'd like to hear what you found revealing, and it didn't necessarily come from the survey, it was a quote that you had, is that if you had 4 final candidates and one was a woman, statistically there was a 0% chance that they would get hired.
Yes, it's not very intuitive because mathematically it sounds like it should be 25%, right? The study that's based on was not one that we conducted, but I believe it has been published in the Harvard Business Review. And it's about the fact that the minority candidate on a diverse slate, which is what you're describing, like a lot of companies have tried to implement, I don't know about a lot, but some companies who are trying to become more progressive have implemented rules that you have to have a certain number of underrepresented types of people when you're hiring for a certain role. And that's to make sure that there's adequate consideration for underrepresented people. If you only have one person, the reason why that unintuitive math is 0% is because of all the implicit and unconscious biases that are sort of facing that person when they're the only. And so you really need on a diverse slate more than one. And we actually had to put that into practice ourselves as a company because we take that very seriously and sort of believe that that's highly probable. It's very believable that could happen.
Yeah. Again, it was just so surprising because if you had 3 women and 1 man, then, that was kind of sort of an equal percent chance. If you had 2 women out of 4, there was an equal percent chance. But if there was only 1, which happens a lot, I've seen that on the slates. We do pre-employment testing. So I often see for key positions who the final candidates are, what gender they are, I always see as their name, but obviously a lot of that goes away. And it's like, okay, there's sometimes is it a token? Was it just a check off the box for diversity? Or was she really the best candidate? Were the 3 men really as equally was she as equally qualified, or were they as equally qualified? But ultimately, if they're not getting selected, then that's a problem. The focus of that was diversity recruiting. And in there, I believe I'm correct that you said that 98% of the organizations said that was a priority in 2021. Yet making a priority and getting it done is really, really different.
Yes, it is.
We're at 5. We're almost into the 6 months. We're approaching halfway into 2021. What are you seeing in implementation? How effective of company being actually walking the talk, putting it a priority and then doing something about it?
I think that where you're seeing probably the most action is where it's most visible. So I think a lot of boards have improved or changed their composition in the last year. Like people are now afraid, like pretty actively afraid, I think, to have like an about us section, where the management team is listed and everybody looks the same in terms of color and gender, because it's very visible and people are worried about being called out. There's, people talk about cancel culture. And I think there's a little bit of that kind of public peer pressure happening such that board members and executive teams are really companies are really prioritizing the diversification of that. However, that is a very small percentage of the total employee base at any company. And so I think numerically, I see a lot of action happening there. And then I think the other place where it's easiest to make some changes is at the entry level. The hardest place is actually the place that FairyGodBoss focuses on is probably like mid-career. That's where changes happen in people's lifestyles, or you hit management and you start hitting some roadblocks to career advancement as an underrepresented person.
So the companies that are starting to do it well, the companies that, and you recognize them often, what are they doing differently to reach below the senior level? There's a lot of work that needs to be done there.
Yeah.
Luke did a great report a couple months ago, and what was it? I think there was out of 100 companies that they tracked, the largest companies, public companies in the U.S., there was one that had a woman of color and one that had a Hispanic. And it happened to be both. She was a woman of color and Hispanic. But there was like 2 companies out of 100 that had an equal representation of women, especially not only women, but women of color and Hispanic background. So what are the companies that are doing well? And if you can share some so people can go and say, here's what we should follow. Here's a good case study.
I think that best companies in terms of behaviors are the ones that treat this like a business problem. Like they actually put the full resources of like business strategy thinking and goal setting and execution around it. So if you say we're going to tie, executive bonuses to a change in demographic diversity, it's more likely to happen than if you don't tie compensation to something, just like a business goal, right? You hit a certain sales target or a certain business outcome, you get a better bonus. Same thing, treat it like a business imperative. And I think there's relatively fewer companies who've done that, but the ones that do, I think everyone's paying a lot more attention to the outcome. And setting those goals publicly and then reviewing them is another big part of accountability that makes it real. So whether you or not you tie pay to it, if you made an announcement, like Accenture several years ago said, we're going to get to 50-50 completely through the entire org by 2025, men and women. That was really brave because they, and every year they keep reporting on their progress to it.
Well, now, and again, this is for publicly traded companies, but now SEC is going to have to be a disclosure with the new disclosure requirements. It's going to have to be much more visible, but that's only obviously the largest companies, and 98% of businesses in the country are small companies, which could be 500 or lower. So it's not necessarily a super small company. What are there some specific steps or specific things that, other than walking the talk and making a priority and actually working, what are the steps like that Accenture takes to make that happen?
I can't speak for any of their internal processes, but in my head, there's definitely a systems approach to that.
You said you changed.
I think first you have to measure. You can't set goals before you measure what your current state is, right? So a lot of companies don't even really know. Like, particularly the things that are not visible. Like maybe a gender, you can make inferences, or race, you can take guesses, although there's more and more mixed people in terms of heritage. My children have a mixed racial ethnicity. I don't know what assumptions are we made about what ethnicity they are.
Check on the census, right?
Right. So, and then of course, sexual orientation, you would never be able to tell, and on and on. Veteran status. There's a lot of things that are not visible, and so if they're not measured, you can't even set goals. So I think measurement and systems is very unsexy, but it's like HR data and analytics. How much investment does a company make in that? Do they understand what the applicant pool is? Are they seeing lots of men apply, and that's why the slates or the hiring is happening the way it's happening? Or are they actively trying to make the top of funnel, treat it like a marketing activity, more diverse and representative of the population?
And I talk a lot about the candidate experience and talking about branding. What's the messaging? Who's visible? And just having your marketing department change the image or the photo that you use. It may be a good start, but then you get into the language. What language is it? So, you talk about job postings, and there's a couple really good companies out there that you can go through the analytics. What's the language? What language are you using in your posting? Is it more geared toward male or female? So where do people start falling out? And then you get into the human biases. Somebody comes in, and I'm sure there's, I started my business career 40 some years ago. And I still remember when you're hiring, you go, well, we don't want to hire 18 and 19 and 20-year-olds because they're going to get pregnant. I was like, okay. And so what? So yeah, there's a whole lot of biases that go into it, and thinking about the process from the very beginning. And, that would be my advice, is looking at like employment brand, what's the brand? What's your imaging? Who's your target audience? And again, it goes beyond just women, men and women. Obviously, that's your focus, but people of color,
Sure.
Hispanic, sexual preferences. But, certainly the languages. I look at job descriptions. Job postings are horrible anyway. But now we're taking it to a whole other level when you start talking about some of the the words.
I mean, it's supposed to convey what the job is. It's supposed to be a compliance document, and it's supposed to be a marketing document. It's a lot.
Well, it shouldn't be a marketing document. The marketing document should be a different message. I mean, you don't, companies don't share their post their privacy messages and their corporate policies as marketing tools. They do it differently, except when it comes to HR, and then they take the legal document and they post it up and say, "Hey, we're looking for you." And if you can comply with all this, we'll hire you. What was there anything that really surprised you in your survey? And I know you just had another survey that came out too. You did it in conjunction with somebody else, but was there anything that just like took you back?
I think that I at this point, I'm so close to so many different kinds of women's experiences. I mean, there's not a lot that surprises me, but the more recent study you mentioned is a really important one because it's about the intersectional experience of being a woman of color. And what is really interesting there is that women of different colors have different experiences and different stressors.
Oh, you're not all the same?
No. It's like and that I think it's just good to see that it's not just, you can say, okay, you have a worse experience because you're a double minority in some way, but that you're more likely to drop out. You're like objectively, and then look at the data. Women of color did drop out more.
Right.
So it's like more women dropped out than men, and then more women of color dropped out than white women. And that just shows the impact of that reality of stress and being sort of having less power and less influence in the first place, and therefore having more reason to drop out.
Yeah, I mean, really a striking. I think it was a result from one of the surveys that I just read, and it was an image. And until you saw it, you can hear it, but until you saw it physically laid out. And I think it was women in average, white women get paid 81 cents on the dollar, so that's one form of discrimination. Black women were 63% or 62% on the dollar, and then Hispanic was like 54 cents on the dollar, which just the disparity is just crazy. But it's just another example of
exactly
the massive inequities, that go on. We've just got a few minutes here. One question I'd like to always ask is, and part of your answer is probably what you hope happens. What do you think will happen 12 months from now? You have your guest back on here. We're talking again. Are we talking about the same thing? What are we going to be? What's going to be happening 12 months from now?
I actually think there's been a lot of hope in my corner of the world, because when companies set these multi-year goals, I don't think it's just a flash in the pan PR kind of statement. Like we're one day after the George Floyd murder anniversary. And that really changed the conversation in corporate America. And it's still happening. Like I talked to someone the other day who said, well, maybe it's a little bit less intense than it was in January. And I said, okay, yeah, but it's still there in a way that it wasn't there. And some people are talking about this as being a civil rights sort of moment, maybe 2.0 or 3.0. Mm-hmm. And I think that gives me a lot of hope. And I'm also seeing it play out in the way that diversity is even talked about in the corporate space, like intersectional diversity is being talked about way more than it ever was talked about. And that makes things more complicated because it's not going to be as easy as, women, Black people, gay people. It's like, you could be all three.
Right. Right.
And how do you deal with that? So, but at the same time, that complexity is necessary and probably at the heart of actually how you really start over. It's like what you teach your kids, right? It doesn't matter what color or type of person your friend is in school. You treat them well. Right.
Gets down to some basics. Just treat people fairly. So, and for who they are. I mean, it was the golden rule was, treat people like you like to be treated. Tony Alessandra and Michael O'Connor came up with the platinum rule years ago. I don't know if you're familiar with the platinum rule, but the platinum rule is treat people like they would like to be treated.
Right.
Right. And that's, I mean, it really was profound then. And they came up with it 30 some years ago, and it's still hasn't gotten through. We've got the FairyGodBoss.com scrolling across the bottom. You can reach out to Georgene and her team. That way, reports are the surveys. The most recent one and the one that I mentioned earlier are both available up there. I highly encourage people to subscribe to the community, especially if you're a woman, but also if you're a man.
Yeah, allies are always welcome. A fairy god boss, by the way, it means anybody who elevates women at work. So,
yeah. Okay, Georgene, it's been a pleasure meeting you. Heard a lot about you, knew a lot of your team, and I really appreciate you taking time out. I know you got a lot to do. I know you got a lot on your plate, but I appreciate what you're doing. And if I can be of continued help to you, please let me know.
Thank you, Ira. It's great to be here.
Yeah, stay safe. Take care.
Bye.
Wonderful. Really enjoyable conversation. It was really an honor to meet Georgene. She's got a crazy busy schedule, and FairyGodBoss is really doing a tremendous amount of work. I wanted to mention, I think they've got 10 million women who are subscribers around the world. So it's a successful startup, successful business, and doing a lot of good work. We are going to take a short break. We're going to hear from our two sponsors, Ngomo and Success Performance Solutions. And when I come back, we're going to do our Q&A, pre-employment testing. So please stay tuned. Thank you for watching Geeks, Geezers, and Googlization.
Imagine growing great employees and advancing emerging leaders for less than $1 a day. The Ngomu app will support your employees in a myriad of ways, from career and personal development to health and wellness. No need to schedule and hold trainings. Just have them access over 90 coaches for live virtual group and one-on-one coaching for whatever topic they need or want to work on. Anytime, anywhere. Learn more at ngomu.com today.
Hiring top talent shouldn't be left up to the roll of the dice. And yet, that's exactly what many organizations do. They roll the dice, cross their fingers, and pray for a better outcome. Hiring the right employees the first time is much too important and way too costly to leave to a game of chance. Your employees and your customers deserve better. For 25 years, Success Performance Solution has been helping small and medium-sized businesses hire smarter. They offer pre-employment and leadership assessments from typing and data entry to C-suite competence. Whether it's production, sales, healthcare, call centers, or management, Success Performance Solutions can help. Visit their website at www.successperformancesolutions.com to schedule a free demo or call 800-803-4303. Hey, welcome back, everyone, to Geeks, Geezers, and Googlization. And thank you for being part of Googlization Nation. If you're not a subscriber to it, please go to googlizationnation.com. It's free. And you will get updates about webinars, the podcast, and some other events that we've got coming up. We're talking, again, if you want to, hopefully you'll attend the next webinar we're doing, which is Friday at noon, May 25th. It's our monthly Gordon report. We'll be talking about ticking time bomb jobs. And then also we'll be, if you like, you can go up to view the two previous webinars that I did. One was your candidate experience is all effed up, FCD'd up. And then also growing and thriving in a FCD'd world, an effed up world. So you can go there. Those two are available 24/7. The Gordon report will be recorded. So if you can't make it on Friday at noon with Dr. Gordon, you'll be able to view it afterwards. You do not need to subscribe to that one. That's just available on YouTube. We'll also be live streaming that day at Friday to Facebook and to LinkedIn. So if you connected with me on either one of those, you'll get a notice. I encourage you to do that. Also want to, again, congratulate Ngomu and thank them for being a sponsor, but congratulate them on the launch of their app, which just happened, I believe, yesterday. So again, a special segment today, something a little different. My business, Success Performance Solutions, We've been in business for 26 years. We focus on pre-employment and leadership assessment, also obviously do a lot of talking and helping people create a better recruitment marketing, better candidate experience so that they can actually get qualified people that are worthy of testing. But pre-employment testing's been around for a while. It's been almost 100 years since it first started to be used, and the first use was likely in the military with the IQ test. I'm not suggesting an IQ test, but there's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of myths, and I do have a number of articles on the site, but every single day I get a request from somebody, whether it's an existing customer or a new customer, but especially new customers, that somebody's boss said, why don't we go out and see if we can find a test because the last few people didn't work out, or we're thinking about promoting new leaders into a position, or we're bringing somebody from the outside in a leadership position and we want to see what their skills are. We do their interviews, but we know that people don't always tell the truth in interview. They're trying to put their best face on. And that's one of the best uses for pre-employment testing. And that's a broad term. So we'll talk a little bit about what's included with pre-employment testing. It's not just personality testing, but what does that mean for the company? What does that, how does that help you? And one of the most common questions we get, is it legal to use pre-employment tests? And the answer is yes. In fact, the Department of Labor has drawing a blank on what the title of the download, the document is, but they talk about the proper ways to use pre-employment testing. And certainly the test needs to be validated, which means it needs to test for what it's supposed to test for. So just as if you went to a medical test and you needed to test your blood sugar, you would need a glucose test. If somebody was testing for iron instead of glucose, it's not very valid. It may be accurate. The measurement, your iron or your iodide or your potassium or whatever it might be an accurate measurement. But if it's not measuring what it's supposed to measure, so when we measure extroversion, it needs to measure extroversion. If it's measuring detail orientation, is it really measuring detail orientation? And the organizational psychologists, the industrial psychologists, psychometricians all take care of that. We don't do that, but they take care of that. So they're making sure that there's a validity, and then there's a reliability. Is if I'm having a bad mood today, does that change my score? Because that wouldn't be very accurate. Because if somebody's nervous at the interview or somebody's putting their best impression on, can they lie about it? How do we detect that? So there's a number of factors that it needs to be valid and it needs to be reliable, that over time people would get a similar result. But so going back to the question is it legal to use pre-employment testing? And the answer is absolutely yes. In fact, the Department of Labor and the EEOC list all the things that are considered assessments for hiring. An assessment for hiring includes your application. So is your application valid? Are you asking for all the information that is only pertinent, only relevant for the job? It may be important to get that information, but if you hire them, but for screening, is it required? Do you need to have their address? Do you need to have their city and state? Not only does it introduce bias, but does it really help you hire that person? And the answer is no, but it's included on there. So people tend to put pre-employment testing in a different category, and in some respects it should be. But the reality is pre-employment testing needs to comply, or the other aspects of your hiring need to comply with the same regimen and the same scientific science behind it as your pre-employment test. So your application, people tend to ask a lot of information there, thinking that it's just the form that needs to be completed. But the reality is it needs to also comply with the validity, the accuracy, and the job relevancy of that. So the factors that when we talk about legal, and again, I'm check with your attorneys. I'm not an attorney, but it is my specialty, so I try to know as much about it. Is that test needs to be valid, needs to be reliable, but but mostly where most problems show up, where companies have been sued and lost. Anybody can be sued, but sued and lost. Some of the case law that's out there is one is either using a test that's inappropriate, so that gets to the validity. They're using a test that's designed for medical, such as the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Inventory. People use that. That's a medical test. It was constructed and validated to diagnose clinical mental illness. Important to know. It would be nice to know if somebody had a mental illness before that might affect their performance on the job or put other people at risk. But medical tests are a whole other game. We're not talking about that, but companies have tried to use that as well. But what we're talking about mostly where companies get messed up or put themselves at risk is when they're using a test that's not relevant to the job. For example, there was a big case law a few years ago that the company, with good intentions, wanted to identify their warehouse, their frontline the hourly frontline people that they were hiring. Did they have leadership capability? Because they knew that they needed to build their leadership pipeline. But to get the job, to do that particular job, they did not need to have leadership skills. But they used the leadership assessment to test frontline workers. The problem with that is that discriminated against a lot of minorities, and they did not meet the EEOC guidelines for that. They were weeding out a lot of minority, the protected class. The challenge with that is that it was a good test. It was valid. It was used at the wrong time. Now, they could have used it after they hired to see which people they wanted how they needed to groom them, which people might have the best hardwiring to become a leader, but they couldn't screen out frontline workers. They couldn't screen out their warehouse workers using a leadership test because leadership wasn't required to do that job. So again, there's a lot of confusion out there. If anybody has any questions or needs help, we always help for clients or people that have worked with me in the past. They always know I'm more than happy to share that type of information with you. So the reality is on that list, whether it's a reference check, whether it's an application, whether it's your interview, whether it's your manager, your interview questions you ask, whether it's the managers who are doing the interview, is all the way down that line are considered assessments. And your pre-employment test doesn't have higher standards and it doesn't have lower standards. Every aspect of your hiring process needs to meet that particular standard. So they are legal if they're used properly. And again, the job relevancy is huge in that. We've got a few more minutes here. One of the other objections is that we can't afford to lose candidates. And I would agree that you need to make sure that the assessment isn't turning away candidates. But one of the biggest problems that we have, that we see with clients, is that in the past, and we recommend this as well, it's just a different marketplace now, is that you had an application. You ask the candidate to complete an application, and that's a whole other story, but sometimes you can't get enough applicants to complete the application. But assuming they did finish the application, asking them to complete an assessment before you've had any engagement, before they even know that you received the application, before that they were acknowledged as, hey, thank you that we've received your application. It looks like you meet the minimum basic requirements. We would like you to go to the next step. And that next step could be, hey, thanks, we'd like to set you up for a quick interview, a quick screening, or an alternative might be the next step might be to complete an assessment. I do recommend having some type of personal contact or an email contact, a kind of an acknowledgement with the candidate before you ask them to take the assessment. That could be automated, but ideally it would be, we've reviewed your application, and having even a 5-minute screen, and then at that time asking them to do that. When you do it that way, when you have some type of engagement between the application and asking them to complete the assessment, the completion rate of the assessments is in the 90%. We have many clients that are approaching 97, 98%. There's always somebody that might object, but that's okay, because if they object to the assessment and that's part of your hiring process, now you understand how they will deal with things that they don't like to do. They will object. If you're looking for people that will voice their opinion and stand up for principle, great. They've passed that test without even taking the test. But if you are looking for people that are going to fit into your general culture, that are going to comply with things that are required and not question every step that you take, then you'll have a higher rate of completion if you don't do it in the beginning. Now, part of that decision, doing it where you actually do it, will also depend on how long it takes. I've heard recently of clients of tests taking an hour and 2 hours and 3 hours. That's ridiculous. Because with automation, with technology, because the science is so much better. We were using a test recently that had 300 questions. And after a revalidation, realizing that there was 140 questions that were not as critical. They didn't have the same relevance. They weren't, you can remove those questions and still have the same high validity and reliability with it. So why ask all those questions? So there's a way to cut that down. The average time of most of our assessments, we have some that are short as 5 minutes, and most of them take 15 to 20 minutes, which is certainly acceptable. If we add some additional time, if we add some cognitive testing, that's all part of that. I hope this was helpful, at least in dispelling some of the myths and helping answer some of the questions and what some of the objections are. I barely scratched the surface, so hopefully we'll do this again in another week, but we're almost out of time today for Geeks, Geezers, and Googlization. So I want to thank Georgene Huang from FairyGodBoss for being for being our first guest and helping us understand diversity hiring, diversity recruiting, and how you can build a more robust, a more equitable organization. I want to thank you, all our listeners, for being part of this. We're in the top 10% of podcasts, according to Listen Notes, and that wouldn't happen without you. I want a reminder to subscribe to Googlization Nation at googlizationnation.com. And want to again thank our sponsor, Ngomu. And congratulations to them one more time at helping people be more with their new app, and also Success Performance Solution for being a sponsor. Reminder, Friday, May 28th at noon, we'll be doing Ticking Time Bomb with Ed Gordon. And you can get to that by going to bit.ly/Gordon Report 521, Gordon Report 521. And until next week, don't let the shift hit your plans.